Yeah, thank you so much for having us. Good afternoon. My name is Alejandra Rosales. I'm a game designer and a game researcher. Right now, I'm enrolling in a master's in political science and international relations. And the focus of my research is precisely studying the representation in video games and its geopolitical implications. And well, my colleague, if you want to present yourself, Aida.
Yes, and thank you very much. I'm sorry for this sound problem. My name is Aida Navarro-Redón, and I'm an architect, also a researcher. I was working as a level designer for 5 years, and now I'm doing my postdoctoral research period at HED Geneva, specifically in the relation between video games as a architectural tools in humanitarian crisis. See, something more or less. Yes. So thank you very much for having us.
All right, so yeah, let's start with our presentation. Playing displacement, the aesthetics of climate mobility in video games futures. So the International Organization for Migration estimates that between 200 million and 2 billion people could become climate migrants by the year 2015. And although climate change is often described as a crisis of displacement, the category of climate refugee remains unrecognized within the international refugee law. I'm talking about the Refugee Convention, 1951, that protects individuals fleeing persecution on grounds of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. Of course, environmental displacement and the category of climate refugee fall outside this definition. And despite extensive debate in international law and policy scholarship, no binding international framework recognizes or protects people forced to move by climate change. And of course, as a cultural medium, video games play a key role in shaping the way climate migration is conceived, the way it is portrayed, and is normalized in the collective imaginary. But in the absence of a legal framework to define it, what happened to climate change in video games? Our argument is that video games aestheticize climate change. Within their virtual worlds, climate mobility takes form through mechanics, environmental storytelling, and affective atmosphere. And contemporary video games depict this displacement's explorable systems characterized by their own distinctive pace and atmosphere. That means traversing submerged motorways, or maybe climbing buildings overgrown with vegetation, or hiding in scorched forests, or inhabiting cities in ruins. So as a result, climate mobility is turned into game mechanics and into movement systems and into the narrative and worlds of the games we play. But before we continue, it is important to define two concepts that we will be using throughout this presentation. When we talk about climate mobility, we mean the involuntary or semi-voluntary movement of population driven by environmental degradation, whether through specific events such as extreme weather, or through slow processes of desertification, sea level rise, or the loss of the loss of habitability. Sorry. It is a broader term than climate migration because it includes people who haven't crossed a border. That is the internal displacement or maybe temporary movements. And also includes people who lack the financial or political means to live even when staying is no longer sustainable. On the other hand, according to migration studies, displacement refers to the condition of being removed from one's habitual environment, whether or not physically crossing a border, whether if the physical crossing of a border has occurred. And one can be displaced without having moved anywhere. If someone's home is now underwater, for example, or on fire, or simply is unrecognizable. So both terms are contested and politically loaded, and the literature on migration studies reflects disagreement about the environmental factors and the economic and political ones. So we acknowledge this complexity, and our point it is precisely that video games simplify or bypass this complexity, and that simplification is ideologically significant. In the virtual representation of video games, there's a specific absence that is interesting for our analysis, because when climate displacement happens in the real world, it is followed by institutions, political dimensions. We have asylum systems, border infrastructure, we have international negotiations, we have bilateral agreements, or maybe class differentiated access to safety, the work of humanitarian migrations, and so on and so forth. But these structures that produce paperwork, decisions, or differentiated categories of access to safety, they are not present in the video games we are about to examine. And almost none of them exist in most of the video games. There are no border guards, no asylum interviews, no international bodies negotiating, no paperwork. And this is not simply a narrative choice or a matter of genre or patient. This absence is pattern and is significant because it produced the same the same void that characterizes international law, the same international vacuum that we mentioned about the recognition of the climate refugee. So the absence of institutional structure itself is a form of procedural argument, because when a game asks a player to survive a climate catastrophe through movement or endurance or resource management, but never asks them to navigate a legal or political system, it is not merely depicting those scenarios, but it is making a claim about climate, the type of climate futures involved, about who they happen to, or about who is responsible, and therefore who is not responsible. And many video games represent climate crisis as environmental constraints, structured through spatial transformation, movement, or limitation embedded in the gameplay mechanics. So, in other words, climate mobility becomes a structural and a spatial condition to be inhabited and navigated. Before we continue, it's also important to draw on the theoretical pillars that our analysis is based. First, bogus procedural rhetoric, the idea that video games make arguments through their systems and the rules, not only through their narratives. So this procedural rhetoric persuades through the constraints and affordances that it imposes on player action. How a game structures movement or resource scarcity or risk is also a way of making a claim about the world. Second, Jenkins' argument on narrative architecture and the concept that video game environments carry storytelling weight. Because game designers function sort of architects of the narrative space. Rather than having linear plots, we have environments that players can explore and through which the story merge. So all these ruined cities, these flooded skyscrapers, or the scorched forest are not just background in this virtual world. These are environmental narratives that players can inhabit and traverse. And they build narrative universe in which environmental catastrophe it is integrated into the explorable space rather than conveyed through dialogue. And finally, Ahmed's work on the cultural politics of emotion and the concept of affect theory, which is the emotional texture of gameplay, the melancholy of moving through a world that cannot be repaired, of the resignation of adapting to a drowned city, or the fragile attachment of protecting a dying species, or the nostalgia of enjoying ruins. These are conditions how players relate to climate's futures. And video games do not merely depict these conditions and these futures, but they let players experience what it feels to live in them. So together, these three frameworks let us analyze not just what these games represent, but how they structure the experience and how this structure serves an ideological function. So through these formal strategies, video games transformed climate mobility from a geopolitical category and from an international crisis into what we can call an aesthetic regime that is grounded in movement. And climate future in this work, these works are not merely represented; they are materialized through traversal mechanics and the environmental constraints within these altered landscapes. So, to examine these formal strategies, we have selected 4 video games, chosen both for their sustained engagement with ecological collapse, but also for their formal emphasis on movement as the central mechanic. So we have Fair, Alone Sails, Submerge, Endling, Extinction is Forever, and Golf Club Nostalgia. In this game, as I said, movement is the primary medium through which spatial and ecological transformation becomes visible. And each game produces what we have called a distinct aesthetic mobility regime. And this translates into a structured way of inhabiting and moving through this world altered by climate. These 4 regimes that we are going to analyze, they're going to be our analytic units, are the melancholic drift, the quiet endurance, the precarious survival, and the stratified nostalgia. So the first one, it is the melancholic drift. Through Fair, Lone Sails, a game developed by Locomotive. It is a side-scrolling survival game in which the player controls the pilot of a vessel across a dried-up seabed through the ruins of a previous civilization that remains unnamed. So the world of Far is completely empty. There are no characters, there are no communities, no border, no institutions. And the player moves through this horizontal plane of ruins without no destination that promises resolution for this climate situation. The core mechanic is the constant calibration of the vessel, and the player needs to collect fuel, repair sails, or maybe respond to the shifting in the wind conditions. And survival here is mechanical and repetitive. So from the procedural rhetoric perspective, this core mechanic encodes the climate displacement as something solitary, continuous, and as exhausting condition. The horizon is never a border to cross. It's just the next stretch of the same world that is in ruins. And what strikes us the most from this game is that the catastrophe is never explained, not localized, it's never attributed to any actor or system. It is atmospherically everywhere, but politically nowhere. So climate displacement in Far is represented as the permanent condition of existence in a world after collapse, rather than as a transitional state within a system of categories of recognition or protection. And this diffusion is not neutral because it aestheticizes the crisis while evacuating its causes or omitting its causes. And the emotional or affective register produced by the formal structure of Far is what we call the melancholic drift that translates into a slow and resigned movement through a world that cannot be repaired and that persists without meaning. The absence of institutional context is not incidental to this affect. It is constitutive to it. There is nothing to appeal to negotiate with or to resist, because in fact, climate change is the world. Okay, now we move to the quiet endurance through Submerge, developed by Uppercut Games. This game plays player in a flooded city where they only can see the upper stories of these skyscrapers that remain above the waterline, and the players must navigate by boat and collect supplies for their injured brother. There are no enemies, no combat, and these formal choices interest us the most from the game because it's this absence of threat that is the most interesting aspect. Because this floated world is not dangerous in the convention game sense. Let's say it is simply there to be traversed, and this vertical exploration of the ruins of the towers and the skyscrapers becomes just something contemplative rather than dangerous. And here, Jenkins' narrative architecture is at work because every floated building is an argument about sea level rise that doesn't need to be made through a line of dialogue. The ruins itself are the argument. And the pace of the game constructs the ecological catastrophe as something someone needs to adapt to and has to adapt to, and not something that can be contested. So it is this absence of threats, this aesthetic stillness that generates what we call the quiet endurance, which is the normalization of catastrophe as the natural condition of the present. Players adapt to these strong cities that has already changed beyond recovery. And there are no aid organizations, no border, no political systems anymore in this world. And this stillness produces resignation rather than mobilization. So, and it's precisely the resignation, the way to inhabit the world of submerge. Okay, now we move to Enlil. Distinction is forever, developed by Hero Studios that features kind of a different structure than the previous titles. Here, the player controls the last fox of its species, guiding and protecting her cubs through landscape ravaged by pollutions, wildfires, and human expansion. And movement is constrained by resource management, the environmental degradation, and time sensitivity, because the fox can only travel a certain distance before needing to rest, and her ability to protect her cubs diminish as the environmental conditions deteriorate. So here, the introduction of a non-human protagonist, this non-human approach, is formally significant because by presenting a vulnerable animal rather than a human character, Enlil does two things simultaneously. On one hand, it intensifies the affective weight and the emotional bond through the care mechanics and the fear of losing a cub. But on the other hand, it simultaneously omits the question of political responsibility. We see the consequences of the pharmaceutical industry, but we don't have this political responsibility portrayed. And here, environmental degradation is both visible, and mechanically consequential, because we witness this slow violence as the destruction of a habitat that unfolds gradually. And Lin managed to make slow violence feel visceral and affectively immediate, but not through a human protagonist whose situation cannot be addressed through political or legal categories designed for human beings. Here, the fox's body becomes the point where ecological harm is felt. Through care and attachment mechanics, and Lin creates this affective proximity, transforming displacement into a fragile and embodied experience. This mobility regime produced by Enlil is what we call a precarious survival. And in this aesthetic regime, movement translates to constraint, risk management, vulnerability. Here is a permanent condition, and care is a constant task in the face of ecological collapse. So these dimensions, the dimension of this precarity, such as who produce the dimension or who bears their consequences, are formally absent. And finally, we get to Golf Club Nostalgia, developed by Demagogue Studio. It is the most explicitly political game in the corpus. In this game, Earth has become uninhabitable, and the ultra-rich have evacuated to Mars, and now they travel daily by shuttle to play golf on the ruins of civilization. The player enacts precise and pleasurable golf rounds across post-apocalyptic landscapes, such as a shopping mall, a flooded airport, or scorched forests. And this Earth in ruins becomes an aesthetic backdrop for the leisure of the super rich. In the background, as we play, we hear radio broadcast fragments that give us sort of the backstory, news reports, political speeches, and also real estate advertisements for Mars. And in Golf Club, climate displacement has already taken place. It is in the past, so survival is not at stake, but is guaranteed through privilege, because the game places the player in the shoes of those who could afford to leave the Earth, presenting a narrative that explores this stratified access to safety. Let's say, in other words, survival is not an issue for those with sufficient capital. So the aesthetic pleasures of the golf mechanics, the precision, the rhythm, and the satisfaction of a well-executed swing is inseparable from the ruinous landscape over which is enacted. And we acknowledge that the game's satirical intent is pretty obvious, because this radio broadcast introduced critiques of political populism and the techno-utopian excess. And this premise clearly rims with the privatized space colonization discourse that's so relevant nowadays. But however, this satirical critique is formally contained within the aesthetic, because the game asks players to enjoy these ruins, and the mechanics deliver this enjoyment. But the political economy that produced this stratification of climate displacement is not represented. For example, questions like who decided who left, through what mechanisms, or on whose terms, are not answered here. So the game provides class differentiated climate futures as a setting rather than as a procedural content. It doesn't ask player to navigate the class system that determines who got on those shuttles to Mars, but it gives you the runes and lets the players enjoy them. So instead of forcing players to confront the structural condition of their privilege, the climate change future remains primarily as an aesthetic of nostalgic melancholy, what we call the stratified nostalgia, which could be translated as the affective register of a class that can afford to feel melancholy about what they have already destroyed. So across these four cases, we can map a landscape of aesthetic mobility regimes that structure how climate futures are experienced through play. As we saw, the melancholic drifting forward, portraying displacement as solitary, continuous, and politically voided endurance that we can see in other games such as Flower, or the second part of Far. Then we have the quiet endurance in Submerge, with the normalization of the catastrophe, this resignatory stillness and no institutional response that we can also see in other games such as Apsu, and Plasticity. Third, the precarious survival in Endling, which translates into this embodied vulnerability and the slow violence made visceral, but sort of depoliticized in the sense that there's no responsibility or institutions behind. Also present in games such as Gibbon, Beyond the Trees, or Never Alone. And finally, the stratified nostalgia in Golf Club, with this class-differentiated access to the rune and the satirical critique contained within aesthetics. that we can also see in games such as Surviving Mars or Floodland. So despite the very different aesthetics and tones and formal strategies, there is a consistent structural absence in this across these 4 cases. That is the organized political response. In each game, the institutional apparatus that governs climate displacement in the real world, it is structurally absent from the procedural logic of these games. No asylum system, no transnational governance, no class struggle, no negotiation between those who cause the catastrophe and those who are bearing its consequences. None of the 4 games simulates the institutional mechanism through which societies respond to or fail to respond to forced displacement. And the consistent absence of organized political response across games made in different countries for different audience in different genres suggests a cultural pattern and a political position rather than an incidental narrative choice. Because these games collectively represent climate displacement as a condition to be individually navigated, rather through endurance or movement, resource management, or capital, rather than collectively contested through political and legal structures. And this normalization has real stakes because cultural imaginaries shape political expectations. And if climate futures are consistently represented as landscape of solitary survival and quiet adaptation or the leisure of the elites, and if the institutional frameworks that could create accountability and protection are systematically absent from those representations, then video games participate in a broader cultural work that renders structural inequality as a natural condition. Of course, we are not proposing that video games about climate change should simulate asylum law, but we are arguing that this consistent absence of institutional response is analytically significant and interesting. And it definitely tells us how climate imaginaries are being represented in the mainstream game culture. So the question we leave open is what a critical aesthetic mobility regime would look like or could look like. Because in our opinion, a golf class nostalgia comes the closest, but as with ARC, the critique is largely contained within the aesthetic and the environmental storytelling, and the mechanics of the game do not destabilize the position of the privileged and the elites that they satirize. But there's one successful example that demonstrates that institutional response to displacement can be procedurally present and effectively powerful for the players. That is Papers, Please, developed by Pope in 2013, that simulates immigration bureaucracy as the core mechanic, producing genuine moral discomfort through the procedural enactment of border control. And we think that there is a model available for climate representation in video games. This combination of a game that aesthetically represents climate futures, differentiated by social class, but at the same time that asks players to navigate or contest the institutional frameworks that defines its protection and represents this combination represents unexplored formal possibilities for video games. Such a game would not merely represent climate mobility as a static condition, but it would simulate it as a political process, making the absent frameworks that we mentioned present. So, in conclusion, video games are not neutral aesthetic objects because when they structure climate displacement as solitary movement across depolitized ruins, as individual endurance, as non-human vulnerability, or as elite nostalgia, they are performing cultural work. They produce climate imaginaries that conditions what feels possible and what feels inevitable. And our analysis has mapped these four aesthetic mobility regimes across a corpus of these four contemporary games. And each game, procedural form, environmental narrative, and affect work together to produce structured ways of inhabiting a world affected by climate change. And in each case, the organized political response, the legal frameworks, and institutional accountability that characterize the real politics of forced displacement are structurally absent. And it's precisely this institutional vacuum mirrors the one that exists in international law, where the category of climate refugee remains unrecognized. So the mirror is cultural, and games, like any cultural form, reproduce and naturalize the assumptions of the societies that produce them. So the task of critical game studies is to make those assumptions viable, visible, and to show, as we have attempted here, that the essence of a border guard or an asylum sister or a political negotiation in a climate change game is not the default state of nature, but instead is an ideological position, and one that can be analyzed, contested, and imagined otherwise. So thank you so much for your attention.